Thank you for attending Fire 2020's webinar, Policy is Not Enough, Preventing Discrimination Lawsuits in Your Fire Department, Part 2. This webinar is sponsored by Scott Safety with support from PBI, Cigna, Tenkata, Fire Chief, and Citrix Online. Thanks for being on call with us today. I am now going to turn it over to your moderator, Larry Sagan.
John, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Larry, you seem to be kind of in the background, but I'm John Murphy. I'm one of your panelists today. I'm a retired Deputy Fire Chief with Eastside Fire and Rescue in Washington State. And I'm an attorney, also licensed in Washington State and in New York. And Beth and I are going to be doing some discussion about discrimination and talking about policy and psychology today. I've done a lot of teaching and writing on the subject, and I'm scheduled to be at the Fire Department Instructors Conference in Indianapolis and a couple other places around the country talking about various legal subjects.
Beth, can you say a few words?
Sure. Hi, I'm Beth Murphy, and I'm a retired firefighter, and I am a psychologist in private practice here in Washington. And I've done some speaking with John as well on issues of discrimination and harassment, and then I'll also be doing some speaking on mental health issues in firefighters at FDIC coming up. And then John and I have also written some articles together. Some of them actually are relevant to some of the topics we're going to talk to today.
That's great. So let's take a look very briefly at the agenda. We just met John and Beth. We're going to be talking about some different policies and what some of the issues are, both from a legal perspective and from a cultural and psychological impact, both to individuals and to their fire department. We had gotten some input from some of you about some of the policies that you wanted to have some dialogue and conversation about. But what we would really like to do is make this as relevant as possible for all of you who are on the webinar. So please, in the chat box, if there are some specific kinds of policy issues that you are dealing with in your department or that you've got questions about, please type those in chat, and we'll make sure that we get those to John and Beth and try to address them during the 75 minutes that we're together. So some of the things that have come in are about probationary periods and hazing, social media policies. As you all know, with new technology, the whole concept of what can people do at the fire department, who's got rights to do that. Tattoo and piercing policies have shown up in a number of departments, and people are trying to figure out how to deal with that. And then I believe that we've got some people on with volunteer departments, and oftentimes policies don't ever really get talked about that much in terms of the volunteer departments. And then we'll do a summary, and we'll have a question and answer period for anything that we don't get to during the main portion of this webinar. One of the interesting things about this conversation is that our culture, the fire department culture, and people's personal behaviors change over time. So maybe John and Beth, could you start by just addressing how the change in who we are as a culture impacts policies in departments?
Well, this is John. I think that it's probably pretty evident, but it's kind of interesting as how our culture in the fire service has changed. And one of the things that is that I've started out in the fire service in the 70s, when a lot of the managers and fire chiefs during that era were veterans of the Korean War, and some were World War II veterans, and that generation had been kind of brought up, or their culture was that, you know, when the leader speaks, the followers follow, and there wasn't a tremendous amount of discussion. There wasn't a tremendous amount of the questions of why we do what we're doing. You just did it because I think there was an order model that was put forward in the fire service at that time, and there weren't a lot of policies that were created in the fire service other than, you know, you need to show up on time, you need to be in a uniform, you need to be ready to go at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock or whatever, and then whatever I say you do, and, you know, I don't want to hear from you. I think our firefighters were pretty much conforming to that sort of cultural attitude. And there was a lot of intolerance that went on because back in those days, the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was mostly a predominantly white male institution called the fire service. And over time, we created policy in order to address some of the problems that were brought forward by the more progressive firefighters. There were policies that were put forward to comply with federal mandates on the civil rights, hiring and firing, discrimination issues, and those sorts of things that sort of dictated policy and culture of the fire service, which has been fairly resistive to a lot of that cultural changes. And so today, in modern times, we still have some resistance. We still have discrimination that we're trying to overcome. We still have a tremendous amount of policy that's developed by organizations to change behavior, but a lot of it has to do with how we view ourselves in this industry and as firefighters, and how the leaders view themselves as change agents. And some agencies, very difficult to change, especially those agencies that are cultured, their cultures are deeply rooted in what occurred in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And, you know, it's a good model. Why do we want to change it? And so that creates some discord and some problems for people that don't look like the typical firefighter that you see, and trying to make some changes into the organization, which takes strong policy and strong leadership.
Beth, can you just, for a quick minute, talk a little bit about kind of the psychological impact on these kinds of culture changes? You know, how does that impact when, especially for firefighters who might have been on for 10 or 15 or 20 years, and things are changing?
Well, I think, you know, in general, change is difficult for humans. We don't typically like change, and change can be very difficult. And so if you are, you know, kind of the, you know, the long timer in your organization, and the community you're serving is changing, and your department is struggling to change with that, then, you know, as you bring in new people, you may start to have a clash between, you know, the people that have been there for a long time, and, you know, they were essentially existing in a department that had one culture, and then you have, you know, new people coming in. So they have a different idea of what the culture is and should be. And so there's one very obvious place where you can have some clashes of ideological differences, basically. And so that can create a lot of tension in an environment. So that is one area where, you know, you need to bring the older firefighters into this cultural change, include them into this change, and then also bring in the younger firefighters so that they can meet somewhere in the middle. And then I do, just on an aside, I wanted to say that, you know, there has been a lot of change in the fire service, and I think one of the things that everybody should be aware of is that oftentimes when you have this change on the surface, there can still be a lot going on underneath. So departments that are usually looked at as being like really progressive, I would say that they probably still have some issues and they're still going through some painful growth, because a lot of times in those environments things go underground. So you're looking at the difference between like covert and overt. So a really progressive department may not have those overt problems, but can have a lot of covert issues. And so those issues are those things that kind of get they get overlooked because they're not so obvious anymore.
We're seeing returning veterans, and there's organizations that have veteran firefighters that have been deployed overseas. There's a federal law that requires that the employer rehire these people after a certain period of time. So some of the things that you want to have in your organization to make your organization more productive and more friendly and more culturally diverse, sometimes are dictated by larger entities or agencies that guide how your organization will work.
That's great, John. How often should departments be looking at reviewing and changing their policies?
That's a great question. Most departments don't ever look at their policy. They have a policy, and then when they need to enforce it, they have to dust off a blue or yellow binder or green binder in the fire chief's office or in the battalion chief's office, and all of a sudden they discover that the policy that they had was written in 1952, which is not applicable to today's fire service. And going through a policy review is an incredibly painful process, because you have to take every policy that you've created and review it for applicability to your organization today, and you want to make sure that it complies with state or federal laws. And so my suggestion is that there's a periodic review. Agencies that have not ever done a review of their policy or may not have any policies should go through their policy manual, at least initially, and make sure that the policies that they have are current and applicable. The second level review would be to take a look at crafting new policies to meet the modern fire service and the applicable state and federal law. And then periodically, and periodically to some organizations is a year or 2 years, but every 1 or 2 years there needs to be essentially a comprehensive overview of what your current policies are, and to update them to whatever the applicable law is. And a lot of policy can be tossed out because, again, remember we talked earlier is that we created a policy to correct behavior on one firefighter, and it's never reoccurred. And so why keep that policy in place if the behavior has been changed and you're not seeing that type of behavior over time?
I'd like to add that having, when you have probationary firefighters, that actually creates a great opportunity to review some of your policies, because, and I'm not sure if every department does this, but I know when I went through my probationary year, we had a book that we had to do, and a lot of it was going in and learning the different policies. And so you come across some of them that you question as a new firefighter, like, why is this relevant? And so it would be a good time to encourage your new firefighters to bring those policies up to their officer and say, why do we have this? Is this a good policy? And then take that opportunity to call out some of those obsolete policies, or to rewrite some policies. So some policies may be really good, but the language needs to be updated to match the current times. So probationary firefighters can be a great resource, and then that also helps with their learning, their feeling of belonging to the organization, and then you create as in my department, they like to say thinking firefighters, which is a term they used a lot when I got hired. They wanted thinking firefighters.
Well, the miracles of modern technology, let's take a look at everybody who's on the webinar and really see how often people are looking at their policies and updating things. Odessa, can you put up the poll question? Everybody, you should have a poll question that pops up on your screen. And we'd love to hear from you. How often are you looking at updating your policies?
Should probably put a category in there, Larry, that says never.
You're right.
So the people that don't respond, we'll just assume they never do it.
Let's go with that, John.
Okay. Somebody's got to do the math. I think the other thing, too, Larry, is that there are some services out there, and I don't want to name them because they may not want airtime, but there are some services out there that will do policy review for your organization. A lot of times, organizations will bring these experts in to do policy review, which is a good thing. And in my department, we did that a couple of times. Not my current department, but a former department. And all they did was cut and paste from other organizations and never really took a solid look at your organization and how policies, the policies that you have are not workable or unworkable. And we got a whole set of policies that had different organizations' names in there. So the quality of work was pretty poor. And obviously that expert, quote unquote, did not do a very good job of exploring what your culture is in your organization and incorporate that into policy, and to take a hard look at what new policies should be required. So you got to be real careful about bringing in the expert witness or the expert policymaker, because they do have to take time in your organization to actually take a look at what your organization does.
So here's the results of the poll. 40% said that they review policies every year. 43% said every 3 years. 17% said every 5 years. Odessa, do you have any idea how many people didn't respond? Okay. 71% voted. So about 29% didn't respond, saying that they are not reviewing their policies at all. So John, you were talking about bringing somebody in from the outside. Are there any other suggestions that, Beth, you might have, or John, you have, to help departments to get this on the regular agenda?
Well, I think, I was going to say, caution about bringing, it's great when you can hire somebody who's a professional in policy writing and policy review, but you need to know that you have the final say. So they may be expert on policy, but they're not expert on your department and your exact needs and makeup. And so, it's important to make sure everything is put into context. So, and then I would add, I think that if you're always looking through your policies, like John's talking about periodically, and I'm a huge procrastinator, as John knows, and when I don't want to do something, I don't like to do it, then I will put it off. And I imagine that's the way a lot of people are when they look at their policies. It's probably the last thing they ever want to deal with. But that's the time when you need to make that a priority, and reviewing them often, and like every day, read a little bit and take out those things that don't belong there. Because if you're always reviewing your policies, then you should most always be up to date. And then it's not going to be this huge daunting task where you have to hire somebody to come in and help you who may not know the needs of your department.
Perfect. We've got a couple of questions that are coming in from the attendees. Stephen asked a question, and let me read this. He said, can you discuss the implications across the organization when policies drafted to address negative actions of personnel are trumped by collective bargaining agreements? Effectively, you make a policy change, but it doesn't have really any teeth to it. And we've got people on board from both labor and management. Can one of you address that?
Yeah, Larry. I think that, again, I'll take my experience back to a department that I came from, is that you remember we talked about the fire chief that was my way or the highway sort of fire chief, and, you know, labor groups be damned. And so he just kind of bulldozed his way through, and there was enough horsepower, I think, in his position that policies that he ran through were pretty much implemented, and the labor group would protest it, but they would go along with it. I think today we have a fairly organized labor group that is very, very sophisticated, understands the effects that a policy may have on the working conditions of the firefighters under contract. I think a smart administrator or fire chief would incorporate labor into any sort of policy change that would affect, you know, wages, hours, working conditions, and those sorts of things, which most policies will do. So if you have a strong labor group and a responsive labor group, and the fire chief and administrators have a good working relationship with the fire chief and the union, I think you're going to have a seamless policy management system. There's some examples where the fire chief made a unilateral decision to make a change in operations, as an example. And the labor group, and they made that a policy. And the labor group, you know, went to discussions. They had meetings. They filed a ULP because there was no headway on the administration side as to what the impact that would have on the firefighters and the community safety. And eventually, that decision in Washington, that we have the PERC, Public Employees Relation Commission, that is like the arbitrator for these issues, and they made a decision that, you know, which was, you know, may have been unfortunate for labor and for the firefighters, but they made a decision that sometimes administration can, you know, do some certain things in order to improve the efficiencies of an organization. And so, is that the right thing to do? You know, you don't want to hamstring your organization in developing policy, but you also have to remember that developing a policy is, you know, a multi-party event where people are affected by the implications of policy, the impact of policy, and it's always good to involve labor in that. Many times labor will have a clause in their contract that does address policy and the formulation of policy. And so if the labor group has a contractual agreement, an arrangement with management, then I think management has an obligation to honor that in the creation of policy. But we have to remember that, you know, sometimes policies are made for the right reason, and, you know, not everybody has to buy off on it. You don't need to get unanimity 100%. You know, if you get an agreement, this is what we're going to do, then I think that's good enough. But it's a lot of work, and it's you know, difficult, not impossible.
So basically, what I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be some level of proactivity here rather than reactivity. And I know both John and Beth, when you and I have talked about these kinds of issues before, one of the challenges that gets faced both on labor and management is that somebody does something where there wasn't a policy, or they did something where there wasn't a clear way of dealing with it, and then all of a sudden everybody gets into a react mode and creates this new set of policy, and it's not really proactive. Beth, can you just speak to that a little bit?
What was the last thing you said? Because your voice faded out to me.
Oh, that organizations end up reacting and creating policy on the fly rather than thinking things through.
Well, I think, you know, it seems that if we just, you know, obviously since my background is in psychology, I look at it from the human perspective, and as humans, we do tend to be more reactive. I think we're kind of hardwired to to react to a situation, and hopefully we learn from it, and then we can then be more proactive. But the reality is that most often we are reactive, and I think that the organization is just, it reflects the predominant attitudes in the department. Yeah, I think that the fire service, my experience and in talking with other people, has been that generally the fire service is more reactive, and they're trying to shift to be proactive. So I think policy comes out of that reactive place, and it's an attempt to then say that, well, we are being proactive now. But do we need to create policy for that one incident and that one person? It's like, can we not discipline that one person, based on the fact that they just, didn't do the right thing, even though we can't point to the exact policy? And I'm not sure. Well, I'm looking at my husband. He's shaking his head no. So, but from a human perspective, we should be able to say, well, these behaviors on a human, decent, moral ground is not the correct way to behave, and it's not helpful to the team building and the camaraderie and all those things that we want to have in the fire service. And so, unfortunately, those are the policies that get in there, and those are the policies that most often bog everything down, and the ones that eventually can get called out through review.
So what happens if a policy is put into place, and I know that this comes up a lot of times, it's kind of a reactive move, somebody screwed up, they look in the policy manual, there isn't anything that really addresses it, and all of a sudden people are negatively impacted by this new policy. What's somebody supposed to do?
Well, I'm assuming that somebody is your firefighters.
Yeah.
And the issue, again, it goes into that sort of proactive as opposed to reactive. And certainly you can create policies based on a reactive knee-jerk reaction. I hate to say that, but by the administration that does adversely affect other people. So for an example, let's talk about hair. Hair grooming standard policy. The organization has the right to dictate grooming standards, and that's been upheld in many cases across the country. But if the policy, for an example, says everybody has to have a mohawk haircut, and you have men and women on your fire department, I think that's to the extreme and somewhat ludicrous. But everybody's adversely affected by that, because who in God's name want to have a mohawk haircut? Maybe a few of us do, but and certainly other members of the organization may not want a mohawk haircut. So how do you get that sort of thing changed, other than revolution and just flat not conforming to the standard? I think it creates, again, and there's probably other less extreme examples of that, but certainly if there's a policy that is not applicable and adversely affects other people in the organization. If you're in an organized labor group, you can, take the protest to the organizational administration or the labor management committee if you have that. If you're in a volunteer organization, you can have the volunteers discuss it with the fire chief, and even take it, to your elected officials, the fire commissioners. So. It's interesting. I got a call from the Midwest a couple of days ago, and this is a policy that the fire chief implemented unilaterally on firefighter physicals for volunteers, and utilized a corporate physical standard and not the firefighter physical standard, which is found in the NFPA 1583 standards, or one of those. I can't remember off the top of my head, but one of the things that the fire chief put in there was able to jog in place for 10 minutes. And so that was a policy that the fire chief put in that affected a lot of the volunteers there, because some of the volunteers they had there were not suppression oriented, they were more support oriented. And based on their medical conditions, they couldn't perform that particular task. And so the question was, is it legal? Well, you know, the legality issue will be settled in the court, but is it ethical? And you know, the ethics of the whole thing is that no, it is not ethical. It creates a problem for, you know, half the department that can't jog in place for 10 minutes, and it's going to also, you know, decimate those in the organization that want to volunteer but can't volunteer because they can't meet a certain standard that has no applicability in their ability to do their job.
Great point. We just got a question in from, well, actually we got it in a couple days ago from Paul, and he asked, if somebody's a probationary firefighter, can they be terminated without as much documentation as a fully hired firefighter that's already passed their probationary period?
That's a great question. Generally, the kind of the rule of thumb is that probationary firefighters are at-will employees. And so at-will employment is, you know, you can terminate somebody who's an at-will employee for lots of different reasons as long as they're not discriminatory. And so one of the big issues that I have, and I know that departments around the country have the same problem, is that you have a probationary firefighter that goes through your probationary period either for 6 months or for a year, and at the, you know, the last minute, the 11th month, the 23rd day, the 8th hour, you get this note from an officer who did evaluation that this guy is not working out or this woman is not working out, she or he needs to go. And so it puts your organization in a quandary as to the lack of documentation as to performance. And some organizations will move their probationary firefighters around if they have the room to do it to 2 or 3 different officers to evaluate performance. And if you have a firefighter that for 2 of the 3 or 3 of the 4 officers that are evaluating saying that this guy is a good firefighter, or this, you know, firefighter is a good firefighter, then on the 4th evaluation you have this person is not a good firefighter. Something has obviously changed. And so the reason that they have probationary periods is to look at the traits, characteristics, work ethic, those sorts of things that you can't pick up in the testing side of it when they first came in the organization. And so that's the purpose of probation, but it really creates a huge problem for the organization when they terminate. Now you can terminate with no paper trail, you can terminate with volumes of paper. There's lots of ways the organization can do it, but the problem is it creates a conundrum or a problem for your lawyer if a person is terminated. For example, if a person of color or a woman is terminated with no documentation, then there can be some litigation coming back for wrongful termination based on age or sex or you know, my skin color. So the more documentation an organization creates justifying the termination, even in a probationary period, the better off that organization is going to be, you know, after that person is gone. And my recommendation also for those who are considering terminating people on probation, I've hired hundreds of firefighters and fortunately only fired probably 50 or 60. And when you terminate somebody, it's a sad event for everyone. But when I've been in organizations that the fire chief says, let's extend this person's probation for another 3 months, it never works out. Or this person has passed probation, there are some questions about this, that, or the other thing. And what you find is you have a problem employee for the next 30 years. So the reason you have a probationary period is to determine, like I said earlier, the characteristics, the traits, the work ethics of the firefighter that you did not pick up when you hired them initially through the testing process. my recommendation is not to extend probationary period unless there's extenuating circumstances. For example, they get deployed or injured. You can do that for a period of time. But in the general sense of things, my recommendation is do not extend probationary period thinking the probationary firefighter will get better, because they do not.
My experience has been that there are generally a couple of different areas where somebody during that probationary period runs into some challenges in terms of what is the department to do. One is able to perform the job, so that's either learning the job, being able to deliver, whether it be physically or they have the capacity to be able to do the job. But the other area seems to be people being able to get along with each other in a living, working environment. Beth, from your perspective, during this probationary period, does it make sense to try to provide some counseling to somebody who might be having problems in that second area in terms of getting along with each other?
Well, yeah, I think that it can be really useful. I mean, as I was listening to John talk about, the idea of having like more documentation. It's like, well, more documentation doesn't help if that's all you got. So you have to have in place a means, and another means to help people along, the more personal side of it. So everybody in the department they have different personalities, and I know that I've had people ask me, well, what happens if you have somebody that's just difficult to get along with? Well, it's like they may be difficult to get along with, but they may really pull through, when during drills or at a emergency scene, so they're a really good firefighter, they're a really good team player, but they're also the person that wants to, be alone out in the bay, going over the engine or the truck or the aid cars or learning equipment on their own, or they, retreat into the bunk room because they're just quiet and more solitary. But when they come together, then they do great work. And I think that having, if somebody is doing really well in their skills, but personality-wise they're just not really getting along, then it may be beneficial to have somebody come in who can talk to them, because in a lot of ways, the firehouse, your crew, is your family, and so sometimes you can't treat the family from a business model. You have to treat the family from, like a family system, psychological model, and it is about, kind of accepting that there are those differences. So, some people aren't going to be as engaged socially, but they're going to be really great out on the training ground or at a fire scene or an emergency scene. And so I think, and again, like if you look at that, like whether a person is friendly or not is usually pretty subjective. And so, going back to the documentation, you have to be very clear on your objective measures and then what is subjective. So when you're documenting, you're really documenting those objective things, like how well are they performing, can they do it, do they need remediation, or they're just failing altogether. And the personality aspect, that's more subjective. And so, that's where in documentation and evaluations you want to be very clear. So I guess, on probation you can fire anybody for any reason, and maybe that firefighter just isn't liked. But is that a good reason to get rid of a firefighter?
Do you suggest that if somebody's having some interpersonal challenges during their probationary period, should they bring in a counselor? Should they have that person talk to one of the captains or a battalion chief? Where and how? And I realize the situation differs in every department, but what are the options for who the right person is to be talking to somebody who's having some interpersonal challenges during the probationary period?
Well, I think having, like, bringing in a psychologist or a counselor would be a good idea. However, you know, I say that, but there's some caution in that, is that if you bring a counselor in and it's for that one person, then you kind of single them out. And so they're already under a lot of scrutiny. And so, you know, really the thing to do is to have a relationship with a counselor or psychologist or somebody like that already with your department, so that, you know, you can introduce them early on, you know, like during recruit training. You could say, you know, we have a relationship with this counselor, and we want to make sure that you all are able to navigate through your first year of probation, and then have that person available, and not just for that person, but also for the officer, because maybe the problem doesn't lie with the probationary firefighter. Maybe there's something else going on with the crew, but because the probationary firefighter is new to that system, they become the target for whatever's going on. So the problem could exist in the crew. It could be the officer. It could be other people working. So, you know, you're not really bringing the counselor in for, I mean, you may think you're bringing the counselor in for that one person, the new person, but the problem may actually lie in the crew. And it could be any one of the other members. And so having an already established relationship and having, you know, creating a history of, like, having that person come in and helping with the interpersonal issues would set up an environment, one, for success, and two, it would prevent, you know, singling out and isolating one individual, because, you know, there may be some conflict, and it may be helpful in order to tease out really what is the issue going on, because it could be any number of things. It's not always the person that seems to be making the loudest noise.
Right.
One of the, Larry, if I could just interject real quick, when you're hiring people, one of the processes I think that the candidate firefighter needs to go through is an evaluation by a psychologist. Because, you know, one of the things that the psychologist will look at is compatibility with, you know, can he play in the sandbox or she play in the sandbox with others and not create, you know, unnecessary destruction. And so if you get clearance initially from the psychologist before they are actually hired in your organization, and then your firefighter starts to develop some issues, is it because of the environment that they're in, like Beth talked about, or are there outside influences like their marriage or finances or children or other things that they may bring to the firehouse? Because we're taking a look at the whole person. We don't want to take a look at just their fire department experience, but, you know, we have other lives. I mean, we have other responsibilities outside of the fire service, and they may affect our performance or our compatibility with the other firefighters. So I think we need to kind of take a look at the whole picture and not just, you know, focus just on their fire experience. I think Beth has an excellent point, and it may be a crew issue, that, you know, anybody who goes in to this particular station working with this particular crew is in the grinder, as I like to say, is that, you know, they'll grind up the new probationary people and make it so difficult for them to survive that they either leave by themselves or they don't perform very well and they're booted out. And one of the things we talked about earlier is that, you know, if you're going to do a good probationary evaluation, you need to get different, your probationary firefighter with different crews, different leadership, and so people have an opportunity to take a look at this individual maybe 3 or 4 times during the year probationary period that they're on.
One more point, and then I'd like to jump right into some of the specific kinds of policy issues. And again, I'd really like to encourage the people on the webinar, if you've got a policy that you are dealing with, that you send us in the chat box, and we'll have John and Beth respond to it. The one other point that I wanted to make is that a lot of cities have got EAP programs. We also, and everybody who's participating in this, if you are in a fire department or working with a fire department, know the challenge sometimes of our culture is different. And so bringing somebody in who doesn't really know our culture ends up going down the drain in a whole lot of situations. So I'm wondering, John and Beth, in an opportunity to try to be more proactive, would it make sense for departments to try to engage somebody from an EAP program in their city or town or county early on, invite them into the department, have them experience the culture, invite them to go on a ride-along, just as a resource, but to help them come up to speed so that if, in fact, you need them, they're not just coming in from a dark spot?
Well, I think, you know, so the EAP program, it's interesting because it's a resource. It's basically they're a referral resource for psychological, financial, legal. So, you know, if you have any issue in those arenas, you go to your EAP, and then they excuse me, they assess you know, what the issue is, and then their role is actually to refer. And the one thing is that there are EAP providers who do almost counseling, like, well, they do counseling, but they're not counselors.
Good point. Good
yeah,
point.
so I think that that's important to know. I mean, from a psychological perspective, I was involved in peer support in my department, and I referred, you know, and this was before I really understood what an EA program was all about. I referred some people that had come to talk to me to go to the EAP, and they were going expecting counseling, and they were really disappointed, and so they weren't happy with what they got. So I think that it's a great resource, but it really is only a referral resource. And so ultimately, yes, you could have them come in and show them the environment and teach them about the environment. It may help them make better referrals for you. But I think that having, and I know, and it's interesting with the fire department, but the police departments have relationships with counseling, well, mostly psychologists, and so they either have the psychologist that they've hired, or they contract with the psychologist, and that psychologist becomes intimately familiar with the organization. The fire service doesn't have that, but they would do well by developing that relationship. I think that EAPs are a great resource, but they need to understand that that is just a resource, and they may not be the type of counselors that they're looking for.
That's great.
But developing that relationship with the psychologist, and much like the police department has, I think would be a great benefit for the organization. And then you can bring them in when you have interpersonal problems, because you already have that relationship with somebody who is intimately familiar with your organization.
Thank you. So let's get into some of the things that people sent in. And as we had discussed earlier, cultures change. And 25 years ago, tattooing and piercing were not nearly as prevalent as they are today. So what's the scoop on tattoo and piercing policies?
It's painful.
Getting the tattoo and the piercing, or the policy?
Both. It's interesting, Larry. As Beth and I had been talking about this quite a bit. Back when I was in the military, if you got tattooed and you were visible and you got caught with a tattoo, you could get put in the brig. And the reason was you were damaging government property, because you were government property for the 4 years or however long you were in. I think that, and Beth's going to talk a little bit about the psychology of tattoos, but what we're seeing culturally is that the tattoos have been kind of morphing into mainstream America and away from the felons and the bikers and the sailors and Marines and other servicemen into, everybody's got a tattoo of some form. Not everybody. So, but people that do have tattoos, it has become mainstream. And some of those mainstream tattoos, need to get accepted as part of the culture of the fire service. And I think the big question is what tattoos are acceptable and what are not acceptable, and who makes that decision on whether the tattoo that I get is an acceptable or unacceptable tattoo. I know that in our department, in my department, we had an individual that had tattoo sleeves, and the depictions on his sleeves were not offensive, to the reasonable person, I guess. And so what his tattoos replicated was a journey that he was taking based on some issues, addictive issues and personnel issues. And there were milestones for him. So there were significant in the meanings of why he was doing what he was doing. Some tattoos are obscene. Some tattoos are racist. Some tattoos are just unacceptable, I think, in mainstream culture. And so as a fire chief and as an organization, how do we put into place a policy that's acceptable, that meets the needs of everyone in the organization? There's a tremendous amount of case law out there as it deals with tattoos, and generally, I was just doing some research the other day that there's a lot of cases in California, especially at the Ninth Circuit, at the appeals court level, is that the cases that were reviewed there declared that tattoos was art and they're acceptable. And what that said was that the claimant was a tattoo parlor that was banned from setting up a tattoo parlor in a certain community, and so he filed a lawsuit and went all the way up to the federal court level, and they said, yes, you can have a business that does tattooing because it's art, and certainly people are required to have those services. There's other cases of not firefighters so much, but police officers in Connecticut that the police chief required them to wear long sleeve shirts and turtlenecks because of the sleeve tattoos they had, and some of them had tattoos on their neck, and they took it to court and they lost because there was an enforceable policy that the department had that said that tattoos would be covered while you were on duty, and that the police chief had the discretion to determine what was acceptable and not acceptable, and so they challenged that as well. And so if you have a policy dealing with tattoos, and I recommend departments put one together, and it needs to be enforced generally across the board. The cases that dealt with firefighters that had tattoos, one of the claims was it was a pretext for discipline. A woman firefighter had tattoos on her neck. She was ordered by the fire chief to cover it up with a turtleneck. There were male firefighters that had tattoos on their neck. They weren't ordered to cover those up, and so she filed a discrimination suit against the department, and she lost because the basis of her lawsuit was more for her discrimination aspect, not so much the tattoo. So you can enforce a tattoo policy. You should have a tattoo policy. And, so the question is, do you need to, is this a bargainable event? I think you need to get labor unions involved in the discussion. But again, the department has the right to establish grooming standards, as we talked about earlier, and tattoos should be a part of that sort of standard.
That's great. Let's talk about if you've got a policy and somebody decides if it's offensive or not, would that be part of the policy? And if so, who should have the right to determine if a tattoo is offensive?
Well, in the police cases, the police chief had the authority to determine what was offensive and not offensive. And again, it goes to that in the eye of the beholder. Even the Supreme Court, in all of their rulings, can't really make a decision on what obscenity is, because again, it's in the eye of the beholder. And so I would use the reasonable person standard as to what's offensive and not offensive. So the question is putting a depiction of Jesus Christ on your forearm offensive, as opposed to placing a swastika on your forearm? Is that offensive? Probably you are going to offend somebody. And so does the police or fire chief have the authority to say you need to cover that up while you're on duty? And my answer would be yes.
Okay. We got a question in from Cheryl. She said, we aren't dealing with this yet, but we can see it will be an issue within the next year. Same gender spouse and benefits for that person. It has already been an issue with using sick leave to care for the individual because current policy does not recognize same gender partner or spouse. Any reflection from either of you about that kind of a policy?
Well, I could just, I'm not the policy maker here, but sorry, our dog is in the background.
Scratching fleas.
Okay, so
sorry about that.
Does your dog have a comment that you would like to make on this issue?
She
was making all sorts of noise on that. Yeah, I just, a comment that I have is just, like the department that I came from when I was still there, they actually recognized and changed their policy based on this. They recognized same-sex partnerships, and they afforded the partners the same type of benefits that they would have if, it was a spouse. And they did it before they, they had to, before, legally, because Washington State now recognizes same-sex marriage, and they had recognized early on same-sex partnerships even before, so like civil unions. And so our department had actually made the changes in their policy before any of that happened, and they saw it as a benefit to their organization because there were, a couple, a few, I'm not exactly sure, but there are a few people that definitely affected. And they did it because it was the right thing to do to help benefit, the organization, because these people were, longtime firefighters and so the department was basically showing that, well, we value you and your diversity, and we're going to show you how much. And so they incorporated or changed the policy and gave them benefits. Now because of the laws changing, they would have to.
John, anything from the legal side?
Well, I think what we're seeing across the country, Larry, and to the questioner, was we're seeing the trend is looking at couples as couples. And so are they afforded the same benefits as if you were a married couple? And we're seeing that trend swing to the yes side. And also in like estate planning for, same-sex couples. Out here, same-sex couples, if they get divorced and are not married, they had to go through the same divorce proceedings as somebody who was married. So I think we've come a long way in identifying, what's the right thing to do. We're seeing, again, cities across the country that are looking at same-sex couples as being eligible for benefits. We're seeing those as being eligible for leave under FMLA, although the federal government is still kind of struggling with that concept. We believe that, as the attorneys, we're seeing some trends that state legislation is kind of taking a look at offering the same benefits to the same-sex couples, either married or unmarried.
Great.
So I think for, just real quick, I think for the questioner, they may want to look around other more organizations, especially in Washington, to take a look at policy and how that policy was generated, offering benefits to members of their organization who are same-sex couples.
Thank you. We've got about five more minutes. let's talk very briefly about social media. That's a big issue. Do you have a couple of quick comments on what departments should take a look at with their social media policies?
Yes. You got to have a policy. Again, we talked earlier, you can't enforce a rule or regulation if you don't have policy in place. Social media is a double-edged sword for an organization. I think it's valuable for an organization to have a social media policy. I think it's valuable for the organization to have somebody who has some expertise in social media because they can advertise lots of different things your organization is doing, and it's a great public relations tool for your organization. Where you get into problems is when your firefighters are tweeting or Facebooking or those sorts of things in violation of a policy in the organization. And the National Labor Relations Board has come out with a social media policy. I recommend people look it up under the NLRB social media policy. Talks about the things that you can do and not do that don't violate your employees' First Amendment rights. And it's also takes a look at what is business to be conducted over social media. And the problems that the firefighters and the EMTs and everyone gets into is that they have a tendency to put stuff on there that shouldn't be on there. And there's several cases across the country where paramedics, for an example, got terminated because one paramedic, as an example, took a picture of their mobile data terminal in their ambulance showing an aid car response to somebody who had a medical condition. And when because they thought it was funny, because of the medical condition, they took a snapshot picture and the paramedic posted it on his Facebook. And it gave the name and address and the medical problem of the particular patient they were going to, violating HIPAA for one. And the other one was, it was just conduct unbecoming. And I think that the paramedic was terminated based on his action, and then his organization created a social media policy on appropriate and inappropriate use.
Beth, any comments from you on the psychological and cultural impact of the social media issues and policies?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, we have a whole generation of kids that are coming up that if you ask them how many friends they have, they're going to say 400 or 500 or however many friends they have on Facebook. And so social media is really changing how people relate to each other, and they're very much influenced by it. And so, and I think that sometimes it's a matter of common sense for us. We're thinking, well, of course you wouldn't post those pictures on your Facebook. But when you look at the fact that the younger generation, that's how they're communicating, that's how they're connecting, then that then creates an issue because it's no longer a matter of common sense, because that's our common sense. So I do agree with John that there needs to be a policy related to social media, and that this is an opportunity to actually be a bit more proactive. I know that some departments have been in the position where they've had to be reactive, but for most departments, this is a place where they can be proactive. So that's kind of my thought on that. And then somebody we got a question previously that talked about like the departments or businesses requiring their future employees or employees to give up their password to their Facebook. And I know John will comment on that from a legal perspective, but I would say, from the psychological perspective, you're getting a glimpse into the person's private life that you wouldn't have normally achieved, before the social media age. And so it's like you see this information, and it's like, what do you do with it? Now, if you're a psychologist, an anthropologist, or a sociologist, you're trained to look at that information and put it into context, and then you can draw some conclusion about that person's culture or societal membership or even their personality. But for most people, there's, you know, it can be inflammatory or unflattering, but it doesn't provide anything useful. It won't unless you have the training to put it in context with other information. And, you know, one of those three ologists that I mentioned would have the training to be able to do that and make sense of it. But for any other layperson, it's not useful information.
John, is there something legal?
I think from the legal, the legal perspective, I believe that the National Labor Relations Board said that asking password information from a potential employee is not acceptable and not legal. So for those, I wouldn't, if you're an employer, I wouldn't even ask for it because like Beth said, what are you going to do with it when you got it? And you can't base your hiring decisions based on a Facebook postings because in the ruling that the National Labor Relations Board made in a case against AMR, American Medical Response, when one of the paramedics was trash talking her supervisor, the NLRB jumped in on this one and said, you know, that what goes on because of the social discourse occurs on a social media site is classified as water cooler talk. And so the water cooler has now become your social media avenue. And so the, you know, the paramedic who got terminated had a large award and didn't get her job back, unfortunately. But you know, the National Labor Relations Board has a good policy, and I recommend that you access their website and take a look for the NLRB social media policy.
Thank you. Well, we have come to the end of our time. 75 minutes goes by very quickly when you get into some of these topics. We had a couple of questions through the chat that we were not able to get to. And so Sheila and any others that we have, what we will do is we'll forward the question to John and Beth, and hopefully they can respond, and we'll get back to you with their response. I'm going to turn this back over to Cammie for closing. Again, I really want to thank all of you for participating. I apologize for the little bit of feedback up front. Each week we're getting better on working through the technical issues. And thank you for your time. Cammie?
All right, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for attending the webinar today. If you would like to contact our panelists for more information about what they do, if you'd like more information to speak to them, we do have their contact information available. It'll also be sent to you in our follow-up email. Please join us for our next month's webinar, Intro-Logging Testing, Issues and Answers. It's going to be on Tuesday, March 19th at 10 a.m. to 11:15 a.m. PST. Some of our panel members include Jerry Greenwell, Dr. Chris Hornick, and Dr. Carl Splander. The registration link will also be included in the follow-up email and can also be found on our website. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to know a bit more about more materials or resources that you can view, or you have any more questions, please feel free to email us at ff@fire2020.org. Notes and a recording of the webinar will be available to all attendees. You should receive that within a week after we put everything together. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to know more about the other programs that we offer, you can also visit our website or give us a call. Once again, thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, and please take the time to answer our 5-question evaluation. And thanks again to Beth and John for sharing your knowledge with us today. We hope you enjoyed all the information and you can use it. Once again, any questions, please feel free to contact us directly.